Late last year, Jagmeet Singh became the new leader of the NDP. Now, since that happened, there really hasn't been all that much discussion around what actual policies Jagmeet Singh and this new version of the NDP are going to represent. But luckily, yesterday he sat down for an interview with Paul Wells in what I really see as truly the first real introduction to Jagmeet Singh and what he represents and what he intends to have the NDP represent as a party. So I have a number of clips to break down here, about 8 different clips, and they cover a range of different issues. He touches on wealth inequality, fair trade, fossil fuels, healthcare, automation, minimum wage, and even at the end, there's a little mention of Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders. So we're going to get through this, and I will just give you a little hint on how I felt about this interview in general. So, as I said, going into this, it wasn't really clear who Jagmeet Singh was. But after this interview, I gotta say, I'm a little more confident in Jagmeet Singh and him being the new leader of the NDP. So let's just get started. The first clip is going to be on wealth inequality.
Right now, we're seeing, last year, Oxfam put out a report that of the wealth generated, 82% of the wealth generated in the last year went to the top 1% of the most wealthy. That's exactly the problem. Wealth is being generated, but it's being concentrated into fewer and fewer hands. That's really the issue. We need to make sure that we've developed an inclusive economy that works for everybody, that everyone sees the benefit of an economy that's working for them as well. So we need to tackle inequality, and I propose a couple of pieces of how we can move towards that. I'm opposed to austerity in all its forms. Austerity is not the way forward. So if we're not doing well and we're in difficult economic times, I believe in deficit funding to ensure that we continue with our social programs that we need. I believe strongly in universal social programs. We need programs that lift people up, that everyone can access. And if we need to deficit fund that when times are tough, I believe in that. The question for me is about how do we put the priorities and the concerns of people in the front and keep that foremost in our minds. Look, we have the Paradise Papers, the Panama Papers that show that there's massive wealth that's being siphoned out of our country, wealth that could be invested into universal social programs, that could be invested in things like pharmacare or free tuition, or expanding our healthcare to include dental care or eye care. So we could invest in these programs, but we're not able to because we're missing out on that wealth. So I propose 2 solutions. One is ending CEO stock options and changing and increasing the inclusion rate on capital gains, so that the ultra wealthy, we would see an increase on the capital gains, so that we can capture more of that wealth. But we need to do a lot more. There's massive wealth that is not being invested in Canada that needs to be.
So I think Jagmeet Singh did a pretty good job here of addressing wealth inequality. So he brings up the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, how it shows that wealthy people in Canada are stashing their money overseas, and because of that, Canadians aren't reaping the benefit of those wealthy individuals' success. So by addressing issues like that, you can then bring that money back into Canada and reinvest it into social programs. And he also touches on ending CEO stock options and increasing capital gains tax. More ways to increase government funding to be able to grab that money and then invest it back into Canadians instead of having it, sit in a bank somewhere, whether in Canada or overseas. Now, let's get to this next clip here, where it's a fair question that often comes up when trying to address, how wealthy people stash their money. How do you keep those wealthy people from leaving?
I've seen estimates that with the stock option loophole thing that you're talking about, you could go and get like $1 billion a year from a very small number of Canadians in the end, a few hundred, a few thousand. What's to keep them from leaving or from moving their business out of the country?
Well, I think there's a certain climate here in Canada that's maybe not the weather climate, but thanks. But there's a certain climate here that's important. The people that come to Canada, we have a stable government. We have a great universal healthcare program. We have a highly educated workforce. There's certain advantages that we were going to have. And that measure of fairness is to the CEO. It doesn't impact the overall, the structure of a company, of its ability to produce a product, to be successful. It's a matter of fairness, and I think it's something that people want to see happen, and I believe it needs to happen.
So I like how Jagmeet Singh answered this question. Now, on the face of it, it seems like a fair question. How do you keep wealthy people from leaving Canada if you're going to address their excessive wealth? But really, when you dig down, there's a number of reasons why people live in whatever country they're living in. So if you're a wealthy individual in Canada and all you cared about was money, then you would already have moved somewhere else by now. Like maybe the US, where there is even less restrictions on you. So there are other benefits to living in Canada, like healthcare and our educated workforce and multiculturalism and, just the people in general. Maybe you have family here. So just because you're addressing wealth inequality doesn't mean that these people are now going to turn around and move their business somewhere else. There are a number of reasons why people stay in Canada. So I'm glad he addressed that, because that's a question that comes up, but I think it's a really weird question. Because does that, the built-in assumption there, how do you keep wealthy people from leaving if you're going to address the wealth inequality, is, well, then we shouldn't address wealth inequality, which doesn't make any sense. So of course you have to address wealth inequality. You have to be able to design a system where all the gains and all the wealth isn't just going to a few number of individuals at the top. There has to be a way to properly lay that out. And there are always going to be people at the top of the system. So sure, let's say a few rich people leave Canada because of new restrictions or because of ending CEO stock options. There are other people that are going to fill those shoes. So while the question may sound all right on the face of it, it doesn't really make much sense, but I like how Jagmeet Singh answered it. Now, this next clip gets into free trade.
You have been asked a lot recently, given all the headlines in the news about free trade, and often you say that you prefer fair trade over free trade. I want to nail you down on the specifics of what that means.
Sure.
Is NAFTA now, is CETA now, and is the CPTPP, the new kid on the block, are those fair trade deals?
Well, I have to break them each of them down. There's components of NAFTA, for example, that are not. They don't meet the definition of fair trade. Three of the key areas, I would say. One is, if we want to strike a trade agreement, first of all, we're a trading nation. We need to have trade. We rely on it. A vast proportion of our jobs in our country rely on a trade agreement, so we need them. But a fair trade agreement, would look at labor and environmental regulations. So if we have an agreement with a country like Mexico that doesn't support or protect the rights of workers, that doesn't have the same environmental regulations, how can Canadians ever compete with that jurisdiction? We need to make sure that we're on a level playing field for competition, but also we have certain values. We want to protect the environment. We want to respect human rights, the rights of workers. So it's a values piece, but it's also a fairness piece so that we can actually have a fair level playing field. So on that area, we're seeing a lack in NAFTA. The other piece of fairness that's really missing in NAFTA is Chapter 11, where there is a clause that allows corporations to effectively sue the country, to sue nations. And we see that one example of it, which is really pernicious, is the water delivery, the municipal system. In Canada, we have public ownership of water. There was a lawsuit to challenge that public ownership and public delivery, to say private companies felt it was a monopoly, that they wanted to be able to sell water privately. And we fought back that challenge, but that's the fear of an agreement like NAFTA, that companies are allowed to make a challenge to something as precious as our access of our water. That to me is not fair. Yeah. It was one of the big cases that Chapter 11 was used, was when our government said, hey, listen, there's a carcinogenic that's being used in fuel. We don't want to allow that, and they said it's going to be banned. Lawsuit was brought against Canada to say, no, that's going to negatively impact our company. And Canada had to roll back a regulation that was to protect the health of the people of our country. That, to me, is not the spirit of the idea behind protecting investors and protecting companies. It should not impede on the sovereignty of our country to make decisions in the benefit of the people of the country, whether it's their health, whether it's for public ownership of a particular service like water or electricity. That's where it shouldn't be contravening or undermining the authority of our country.
So some more good answers from Jagmeet Singh, and some actual specifics once again. So he touches on how he's not necessarily for free trade, but he is for fair trade. And fair trade means labor protections and environmental protections, and not putting corporate interests over the interests of citizens in whatever country that corporation is operating in. So currently, that's what the Chapter 11 provision in NAFTA does. It puts the interests of corporate profits over the interests of the laws in that country. So he brings up two examples where this has actually been used. So there's been a lawsuit on public ownership of water because a corporation thought that they could, take that water and sell it. Why should it be the ownership, or why should the public own it? And the public owning it impeded on their ability to make money off it. So this sort of thing, like this kind of provision, it's not just, sitting in NAFTA because it makes corporations feel good. No, they actually utilize it. They utilize it so that they can try and make as much money as possible. Even if they think they're going to lose the lawsuit, they'll try anyways. And it's a complete waste of time and would be an actual impedance on a nation's citizens if they're actually successful. And in one instance, he brings up they were successful, where Canada had to roll back a protection on a carcinogenic in fuel. So there's an instance where the interests of a corporation, their ability to make money, was prioritized over the interests of the citizens of the country. Now, by addressing that, you get closer to fair trade and not simply free trade, where people like neoliberals like Justin Trudeau are putting the interests of corporations over the interests of the people, of the citizens of the country. Now, let's get to the next clip here, which discusses fossil fuels and sustainable jobs.
If we look at our country, it's a resource extraction country. Let's be honest. Whether it's fossil fuels, whether it's mining, whether it's oil and gas, our country is based on resource extraction, meaning that many jobs rely on these sectors. And so that's a reality. But where is the world headed? Where is the world headed in terms of reliance on certain substances? I think it's really clear if you look at recent agreements that countries have signed to have a full ban on fossil fuel-based or carbon-based vehicles in the future. We're seeing car companies committing to having all electrified vehicles. There's a certain direction that we're headed in society. And that direction is going to be towards sustainable energy and sustainable jobs. So if I'm looking from a position of leadership about the direction that we need to plot for our country, the course that we need to chart, then it has to involve an understanding of the future, and a future that's not going to rely on these resources the same way, and also an environment that's severely damaged because of the over-reliance on these materials. And so for me, the future means we can't have economic justice without environmental justice, and vice versa. So we can't actually tackle issues of the climate without making sure that people still have jobs. And that's going to be my commitment, that how can we transition people into jobs that are not jobs of the next 5 years, but are jobs of the next 50 years.
So once again, these are great answers. He's addressing how there's been too much focus on the short-term gains. And that's why there continues to be this push for fossil fuels. Justin Trudeau currently right now is pushing a new pipeline. We're talking about a dying industry. The oil and gas industry is slowly going away. It's going to be replaced by other types of energy and jobs. But because of the short-term potential gains and because of the oil and gas company interests influencing the Liberal government, Trudeau is capitulating to what they want to do, as opposed to looking ahead and seeing where the society is going in general and focusing more on sustainable industries and jobs, where these jobs will actually be there for the next 30, 40 years, as opposed to the oil and gas industry, where the jobs are slowly going to go away. Now, there's one great quote here he makes, and that's, "We can't have economic justice without environmental justice." And I completely agree. Now let's get to the next clip, which is on healthcare.
Tommy Douglas had this vision of making sure that everyone had access to healthcare. And I think with any vision or any dream, you have to remain vigilant. And our healthcare it's a great system, but there are certain flaws in it. There's certain things that we need to improve. So we need to make sure the investments match our commitment. If we're committed to universal healthcare, then the federal government has to commit to investing in that. And we've seen an erosion of that commitment in terms of investments. Without pharmacare, you have a situation where people get ill, they can't afford the medication they need to get better, they get more and more ill, and they get in a position where they're drastically unhealthy, and they have to rely on emergency healthcare, and that's incredibly costly. That to me makes no sense. It's wrong in terms of the morality of it. It's just a wrong thing, but also doesn't seem to be a good use of our resources. If we actually invested up front in a program that allowed people to have access to medication, they wouldn't get so ill in the first place, and we can manage that health.
So, more great answers. I'm trying not to make this a love fest, but I have to be honest, most of what Jagmeet Singh said throughout this interview, I thought was spot on. Now, we will get to a point at the end that I kind of don't really agree with what he said, but let's just stick to the clip I just showed you for now, and that's on healthcare. So, he talked about how we don't have a perfect system, and there are ways that we can address our system to improve it. And one of them is just simply investing more in our healthcare system, but also bringing in things like universal pharmacare. So currently, this is something that other countries that have universal healthcare do have, but we don't. Now, that said, our pharmaceuticals are cheaper than the US, but the US shouldn't be the bar for our healthcare system. We should continue to improve upon it in relation to other countries, and also just what our citizens, deserve. So pharmacare is one issue. I kind of wish he brought up dental care. He didn't. I'm not sure if that's going to be part of the NDP's plan to include universal dental care, but I hope it is. Now, let's get to the next topic here and clip, which is on automation.
From Alan Harris via Twitter. He says, "Dear Mr. Singh, with automation and AI defining the next industrial revolution, what does the NDP plan to do about the massive number of people for whom there will exist no jobs?"
Yeah, it's a real concern. I think we need to be prepared for that and think ahead and think about how we can implement opportunities to train. There always will be needs to provide input into, if it's AI, folks that help program the AI, provide input into how it should be directed and how it should be modified. So I think we need to be really forward-thinking and look, there are certain changes that are going to happen, and we need to start building in a transition towards, how do we operate in a world without drivers of cars? We need to think about that. The other piece is there is a strong argument for a basic income, and how basic income could address some of these concerns. It's something I'm looking at as well. Now my parliamentary leader, Guy Cameron, really talked about a universal kind of across the boards basic income guarantee. I like the idea a lot. I talked about basic income guarantees for certain communities, so for seniors, for Canadians living with disabilities, and for the working poor. I think we need to look at that as a justice piece, as a way of tackling inequality in a practical way, and a way that we can use the federal government's resources to actually help people's lives.
How can you afford it?
We talked about some of the solutions. One is making sure that we tackle the massive amount of wealth that's being siphoned out of our country, CEO stock options and tax havens. There's been some reports that the amount of money that we're losing each year is in the multi-billions of dollars, and there hasn't been anyone that has had the courage to tackle this issue, and something that we as New Democrats believe we must, and we can use that to fund some of the important investments we need to make in social programs.
So finally, there's something here that I can disagree with, and that's his approach to basic income. So I do believe in a basic income system, but the way Jagmeet Singh seems to be explaining it is that he sees that we should implement basic income for certain individuals, like seniors or people who are the working poor. But by limiting basic income to certain groups, that's essentially a modified welfare system, and it no longer becomes basic income. The whole point of basic income is that everybody gets basic income, so that all of our basic needs are met. Now, the problem I have with limiting it to certain groups is that you may want to try and be in that group. So say you're working at Walmart, and you're making enough of a living to live off of, to have food and have a roof over your head, but you just don't meet the threshold of being part of a basic income group. Well, then what's stopping you from saying, screw this job, I want to go have basic income instead? Because I'm almost there anyways, except I'm now wasting 8 hours a day on this job. So let me just go quit this job and now be part of basic income. So I'm not sure how you would protect against that if you're limiting basic income to certain groups. The whole point of basic income is that it touches everybody. Now, I am glad that he is open to basic income in general. So I feel like this is an issue that he can be moved on, but we're going to have to see, I don't know, what the NDP rolls out once they actually start rolling out their plan. And that may start happening next week. So hopefully we'll get a little more specifics on that. Now, the next clip here is on the minimum wage.
The NDP ran on a federal minimum wage last time.
Absolutely.
Would you maintain that policy? Would you tweak it? What would you do about the minimum wage?
We've committed to it. As New Democrats, we've led the charge in the province of Ontario. Andrew Horwath committed to $15 minimum wage. Then the government followed suit. Federally, we've led on this. This has been a file that we've been champions on, and I want to continue to lead on that. A livable wage is our goal, but the first step is to raise minimum wage. And the 15 in Fairness has been a campaign across Canada, even in the States, and it's an important starting point. But we also have to acknowledge it's a starting point. The next stage is to make sure that all wages are livable wages.
So the minimum wage has been a big issue in Canada recently because Ontario just recently raised it to $14 an hour, and it's going to be $15 an hour next year. And I believe another province has promised to raise theirs as well. So this is an issue that's in the minds of voters currently. And I do like how Jagmeet Singh addresses it. So the NDP's position has been $15 an hour, but he brings up how that's really just the starting point. And we need to look at what should the livable wage be, and maybe how that wage should increase. So if the NDP just said, well, $15 is our goal, and then, we're good, then it's really not a forward-thinking position. But by looking at it as we need a livable wage, then it becomes a number that is more malleable. And sure, it may hit 15, but then where does it go from there? So I like that approach as opposed to an approach where if we have it, then we're done with that issue. This is more of an approach that will continue to evolve as wages continue to stagnate. So we need to look at a way to keep those wages increasing and not just sit back and be happy once we hit $15 an hour. Now, this next clip here deals with, this is the last clip, and oddly, Jeremy Corbyn, Bernie Sanders, and the LEAP Manifesto all come up at once, though none of it's really addressed properly. But see for yourself.
We've seen stories to the effect that people associated with Jeremy Corbyn, people associated with Bernie Sanders, are going to come at the invitation of people associated with the LEAP Manifesto and try and essentially disrupt the NDP convention. It's got to be a pain to have these folks who appear every 2 years and want to announce the NDP what its agenda is, and then you don't hear from them again until the next convention 2 years later. Or do these folks from around the world help to broaden your tent?
Well, I think that discussion and debate is important, and people are going to have different opinions. I think the values underlying them are all the same. We all believe, progressives or New Democrats or people that care about one another, people that care about their neighbors, all want to build a world that's fairer and it's more just. I think that we can find that commonality, that common thread, and build on that. I think sometimes folks focus on the minute differences, but really there's so much we have in common in terms of people that want to care for one another and take care of our neighbor, take care of this place we call home, our planet. I think we have far much more in common, and we can build on that.
So this was probably Jagmeet Singh's worst answer, but I guess that's fine. I mean, this wasn't about policy, so it's not all that important. But to try and go over what Paul Wells was talking about, next week before the NDP convention, there is going to be an event hosted by Naomi Klein, who is a progressive author and Canadian, and also members of the Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders teams, to discuss the LEAP Manifesto, of which Naomi Klein is a main driver of. And the LEAP Manifesto is essentially this booklet of progressive ideas that and policy that they want to see adopted that will drastically change the way our country has been run under neoliberal rule for the last 30 years, along with the US, the UK, and other countries. So it's really a forward-thinking, I don't know what to call it, a booklet? I guess manifesto is why it's called Elite Manifesto. So it's really a forward-thinking manifesto about a large focus on environmental protections and on how to address wealth inequality. Now, when it came out before the 2015 election in Canada, there was all this uproar from the media thinking it was too crazy. It was too forward thinking. They were asking for too much. How can we pay for all these things? But this is what bothers me is this happens constantly behind the scenes on the right. So corporations and think tanks are always pushing their ideas on political parties. But that doesn't make headlines. But because the Elite Manifesto was pushed by activists and authors, all of a sudden that makes headlines. And it's a big deal. And oh my God, there's no way we can implement these ideas. They're too progressive. But again, there's this blind eye that's turned to think tanks and corporate interests. So it's really this weird discussion where anytime a progressive asks for anything, it's a big freaking deal. But when corporations want oil subsidies, it gets like a tiny headline in the back of the newspaper. So there really needs to be this refocus on make sure that we're actually having a fair discussion around policy. Because right now, there is this hold from corporate interests and neoliberal think tanks on our current political system. And that's why people like Paul Wells, who I think for the most part did a great job here, he's in this bubble along with the rest of the media that doesn't have that self-awareness to think or to realize that, wait, yeah, this Elite Manifesto isn't really much different than what the right wing is doing. So why are we making a big deal out of this? But whatever. The other part of that I don't think I mentioned yet, but it it doesn't really matter, but I wanted to mention it, is how Paul Wells pronounced Bernie Sanders. He said Bernie Saunders. This is a thing I've heard a lot of Canadians do, and I don't understand why.
People associated with Bernie Saunders.
We don't say, I'm going to go to the beach and lay in the sand. No, I'm going to go to the beach and lay in the sand. Maybe he says sand. Maybe Canadians say sand and I never noticed it. So, I don't know, but it's not sand. It's Sanders. So I just wanted to say that. Now, a few more things before I get out of here, because oh my God, that was a lot of clips. 11 minutes of clips. Damn. So there are some clips that I didn't show because they're just too much, but I do want to give them a brief mention. So Jagmeet Singh also mentioned how he wants to see pay equity be law. He wants to do something about police discrimination, such as carding, which is a big issue, especially or was a big issue in Toronto. He wants to address the cost of housing for young people, which is not just an issue in, Vancouver and Toronto anymore. It's an issue really around the country. And a couple other issues here. He mentioned electoral reform, which was a big promise that Trudeau had. That was, of course, broken, where we were going to hopefully move towards proportional representation because first past the post is an archaic system that doesn't properly represent the citizens of the country. But no, because the Liberals won a majority on first past the post, they're going to keep it, even though they promised to change the system. But hopefully, and I do believe Jagmeet Singh here, he does want to address that, to actually have an electoral system that does properly represent the citizens. And the last piece here, he's thinking about at least, waiving federal interest on student debt, because the government shouldn't be making money off of the backs of students that don't have any money. So overall, I'm impressed. I was surprised that Jagmeet Singh got into specifics. It wasn't just flowery language like it had been for a lot of the NDP leadership race. So I like the direction this is going. I'm a little more optimistic now about the NDP and what the party is going to become. So let's hope he starts to deliver on this and actually puts out a full platform on what the NDP will be about. But of course, the actual election is until 2019, so like 3 years away. So we got a way to go. Wait, 2019? That's next year. No, wait. 16, 17, 18. Wow. Okay, you know what? This election is closer than I thought. We're in 2018 right now. Holy. Okay, well, hopefully we get more specifics next week from the NDP convention on what that platform is. And we can actually begin to go through it, nitpick, and maybe even get possibly excited about what the NDP will soon represent.